Hi U12, Mr. Dong and Mr. Gibson here. Today we're just going to be looking in the screencast at outsourcing, looking at what it is and some of its advantages and disadvantages before we have our class discussion or debate online in our forum. So first of all, outsourcing is the use of an external provider to perform business activities. And the theory behind outsourcing is that when a service is performed by an external provider that specialises in the particular business function, it will be able to do it at a lower cost and with greater effectiveness than if the same tasks were done within the business. And often this is done overseas in companies in China and India.
Cool. Outsourcing is often called business process outsourcing because it's often just one specific process of the business that you give to an external vendor. So for example, with operations, you could outsource your manufacturing or maybe your design or your merchandising or your sourcing or your distribution or your logistics. A lot of other businesses outsource their human resources process, especially small businesses who don't really have time or the expertise to do that themselves. So that can be your remuneration, your employee counselling, your data management, and even just down to hiring people and firing people can be outsourced. Thirdly, you can outsource your administrative work, so your data entry and all your back office stuff, you can outsource that. And finally, IT. An increasing number of businesses outsource all their IT, all their internet, and also their desktop systems to external vendors.
So now we're going to look at some of the advantages of outsourcing. So the first is increased efficiency. So outsourcing allows businesses to access cheaper labour where there's regulatory differences and skilled labour in offshore locations, and these all lead to cost savings for the business. Another is access to specialised skills and resources. So a business outsourcing to a nation such as India or Vietnam or China may find that there's access to highly skilled and disciplined labour at lower costs than in countries like Australia or the US. This gives the business savings as there's no need to spend as much money on training and developing labour resources. And there's also improved performance by the business. So the use of outsourcing enables the business to focus on what it can't outsource, things that it specialises in, and it allows it to do that better and to focus on its main function in order to improve profit and efficiency.
Some of the disadvantages with outsourcing. Outsourcing is a relationship effectively between the business and the vendor that they use. And often it's a relationship that leads to a lot of confusion. So it's a relationship that needs to be managed, and because these relationships typically last a few years, that can be very, very difficult. And like Mr. Dong said, as a lot of outsourcing happens across countries, there's often cultural differences and language differences, and just differences in the way that business is conducted and problems are managed. So there can be kind of a misalignment between the business and the vendor in terms of what they're expecting about agreed service levels and how they measure performance. Second disadvantage can be kind of the loss of control that a business has over its standards and the security of its information. So, for example, when Mattel tried to outsource their manufacturing to China, the toys that were made there contained way too much lead. And that's because Mattel lost control of the standards because they outsourced that process. Similarly, Australian banks have found that some of the outsourced operations they've given to Indian firms don't have the same privacy security as we do here in Australia. So a lot of the previously in-house systems that have been outsourced to India have a really low privacy security. Thirdly, hierarchies. Often business, when it outsources, it's trying to get rid of the hierarchies that are making it inefficient. But because these outsourcing agreements can be really complicated, you can just get just as many hierarchies forming in your outsourcing department as you had before. And finally, a really controversial one, which you may have heard about in the news, because outsourcing often leads to a lot of business change and redesign, it often leads to a business downsizing or making a lot of its employees domestically redundant, which can be a very unpopular decision. And though some businesses try and get their current employees to move overseas or to the region where they're outsourcing, this can be very difficult as they try to get work permits and visas.